The end of their world began with a line drawn in charcoal on a sheet of vellum. It was a graceful, defiant curve, a single stroke that captured both strength and surrender. Outside, a late October rain whispered against the large skylight of Chloe's home studio, the sound a gentle percussion to the low hum of her workstation. The air smelled of wet asphalt, strong black coffee, and the specific, dusty scent of graphite that always clung to her. Liam stood behind her, his hands gently kneading the tense muscles of her shoulders. He watched her hand, the charcoal held between her fingers, as it moved with a practiced certainty that still mesmerized him after all these years. "There," she breathed, leaning back into his touch. "That's the spine of it." On the drafting table, pinned beneath the vellum, was the schematic for the new Westmeyer Museum of Art. It was the project of her career, the one that could finally catapult her firm and her name into the stratosphere of architectural reverence. For weeks they had lived in this room, a sanctum of shared thought. Their nights had fallen into a familiar rhythm. Chloe at the table, Liam in his worn leather armchair, surrounded by teetering stacks of books on structural engineering and aesthetic theory. He was her sounding board, her secret weapon. He wasn't an architect, but as a former critic, he understood the language of space, the poetry of a well-placed void. He helped her find the why behind her what. "It's bold," he said, his voice a low rumble. He leaned closer, his chin almost resting on her shoulder, his gaze tracing the line she had drawn. "It pulls the visitor in, but it also asks something of them. It's not a passive experience." "That's what a museum should be," she murmured, her eyes still fixed on the drawing. A flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, crossed her face. "Rex thinks we need a statement piece for the entrance. Something louder." Liam's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Rex Thorne, Chloe's boss, a man who wore his charisma like a tailored suit, all sharp angles and dazzling surfaces. Liam had met him a handful of times at company events. He found the man's smile too wide, his compliments too smooth. "Rex understands branding," Liam said carefully, resuming his massage. "You understand buildings. There's a difference." "I know," she said a little too quickly. "It's just, the commercial reality." She tilted her head back, looking up at him, and the doubt vanished, replaced by the familiar warmth that had been his anchor for 14 years. "That's why I have you. To protect its soul." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. He bent down and kissed the top of her head, inhaling the faint scent of her shampoo. This was their foundation. Not the house they lived in, a charming but perpetually half-renovated craftsman, but this intellectual intimacy. It was a space built of trust and shared language, a structure he believed to be unshakable. He had set aside his own ambitions. One critically acclaimed but commercially invisible novel, The Morality of Load-Bearing Walls, now serving as a heavy, handsome doorstop, to become the silent partner in her ascent. Her success was his, her vision was theirs. The next day was their anniversary. 14 years. He'd left the city early, a rare first edition of Louis Kahn's writings, lectures, and interviews, wrapped in simple brown paper on the passenger seat. He imagined her delight, the way her eyes would light up at the sight of the book, the hours they would spend reading passages aloud. He felt a swell of quiet, profound contentment. This was substance. This was the real architecture of a life. He pulled into the driveway, noticing her car was already there. Strange. She was meant to be in a marathon session with Rex and the team, finalizing the presentation materials. Maybe they'd finished early. A wave of excitement hit him. A whole unexpected evening together. The front door was unlocked. He stepped inside, a grin on his face, ready to call out to her. But the house was silent. Not the peaceful silence of creative focus, but a humming, empty silence. No music, no television. Just the low thrum of the refrigerator. "Chloe," he called out. Nothing. He walked through the living room, setting the gift on the dining table. He headed towards the back of the house, towards the studio. It was her sanctuary. Their sanctuary. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The rain had stopped, and a weak afternoon light filtered through the skylight, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Her drafting table was exactly as they had left it, the charcoal spine of her design waiting patiently. But it was the light from her laptop on the smaller side desk that drew his eye. It was open, the screen glowing. She never left it on. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. It was an instinct, primal and cold. He walked over to the desk, and there it was. A messaging app was open, a thread of conversation between Steve Ants and Rex T. His eyes scanned the last few messages, his brain struggling to process the words, which seemed to warp and shimmer before him. Rex T. Board meeting moved up. Friday morning. We need to be bulletproof. Steve Ants. I know. I feel good about it. The central gallery is the key. It feels important. Rex T. Important doesn't win commissions, Chloe. Impressive does. I'm telling you, we flip the script. Ditch the deep stuff. We give them a glass and steel showstopper, something that looks good on Instagram. CV Ants. That's not the design. That's not the soul of it. Rex T. Forget the soul. I'm trying to make you a star here. Trust me. Besides, can't stop thinking about last night. You were incredible. Liam felt the air leave his lungs in a silent rush. His blood ran cold. He scrolled up. The screen was a blur of blue and gray boxes, a week's worth of exchanges, flirtations, inside jokes, emojis that made his stomach churn. And then, the logistics of their affair laid out in casual, brutal detail. My place tonight? He thinks I'm at the site. Can't wait to have you all to myself again. But it was the other betrayal, the professional one, that felt like a physical blow. It was a demolition of everything he thought they shared. Rex wasn't just sleeping with his wife. He was actively coaching her to abandon her principles, to trade her artistic integrity for a hollow, marketable facade. And she was letting him. She was considering it. The conversation was a blueprint for a lie, and she was the lead architect. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He could hear his own heartbeat, a slow, heavy drum in his ears. He looked from the screen to the drafting table, at the beautiful, honest line she had drawn just last night while he massaged the tension from her shoulders. He thought of her words. That's why I have you? To protect its soul. He slowly, deliberately, reached out and closed the laptop. The screen went dark, but the images were burned into his mind. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything. A profound, seismic sorrow settled over him, so vast and empty it felt like the final design for his own ruin. He had been erased. Their foundation, the one he believed to be built on bedrock, was nothing but sand. And the tide was coming in. He did not move for what felt like an hour. He simply stood in the silent studio, the ghost of the screen's glow imprinted on his retinas. The anniversary gift on the dining table seemed to mock him, a relic from a life that had ended the moment he'd scrolled up. When he finally heard her key in the lock, a terrifying calm washed over him. It was a chemical reaction, grief metabolizing into something else, something cold and clear and hard. Chloe entered, her face flushed with a mixture of fatigue and feigned excitement. Liam, you're home early. I'm so sorry. Rex kept us all captive. You would not believe the last-minute changes. She dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter unnaturally loud in the tense silence. She came towards him, ready to wrap her arms around his neck. He stepped back, a single, almost imperceptible movement, and gestured to the wrapped book on the table. Happy anniversary, he said. His voice sounded foreign in his own ears, a recording played from a great distance. Her smile faltered for a second as she registered his stillness. Oh, Liam. She picked up the gift, her fingers fumbling with the paper. When she saw the cover, the faded title, her breath caught. Louis Kahn, the first edition. How did you even find this? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his for the familiar, shared joy. He gave her nothing. He simply watched her. I have my sources, he said. I love it, she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too thin. She was holding a piece of their shared history, a testament to the values she was actively being coached to betray. The irony was so thick, Liam felt he could taste it, metallic and bitter like blood. Thank you. She clutched the book to her chest like a shield. The evening passed in a haze of polite conversation. He asked about her day. She gave him the sanitized version. He feigned a headache. She feigned concern. They were two actors performing a play about a happy marriage, the script of which had just been torched. 3 days later, the performance continued. 3 days of Liam observing her every move. He watched her on her phone, saw the quick, hidden smiles she thought he didn't notice. He listened to her on conference calls, her language shifting, incorporating Rex's corporate jargon. Synergy. Optics. Monetizable footprint. She was trying on a new identity, and it fit her as poorly as a cheap suit. The grief in him didn't lessen, but it now had a companion. A cold, dispassionate curiosity. He was no longer her husband. He was a critic, watching a flawed structure being erected before his eyes, noting every crack in the foundation. On Thursday night, she cornered him in the studio. She had that nervous energy again, the same she had on the night of their anniversary. She was holding an iPad, its screen glowing. Can I show you something? She asked, chewing on her lower lip. I've had a breakthrough on the museum. Liam sat in his leather armchair, the one from which he had helped her build worlds, and steepled his fingers. Show me. She navigated to a file, the slick corporate logo of her firm flashing for a moment before a 3D rendering filled the screen. It was a building, of sorts. The defiant, graceful curve, the spine of her original vision, was gone. In its place was a monumental glass box, intersected by a garish, swooping white fin that served no structural purpose. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly devoid of meaning. It was a building that shouted its own importance, desperate for attention. It was Rex Thorne in architectural form. I realized, Chloe began, her voice gaining a rehearsed confidence, that my original concept was too internal, too quiet. It wasn't engaging with the public sphere in a dynamic way. This version, she swiped, showing another angle. This creates a spectacle. It's an icon. Rex calls it the Instagram moment. Liam remained silent. He looked at the soulless render, then at his wife's face, so full of desperate hope for his approval. He saw the lie she was telling herself, the flimsy scaffolding she had built around her own compromise. She wasn't just cheating on him, she was cheating on herself, and she was asking him to be an accomplice. She was presenting him with the evidence of her affair. Not the sexual one, but the intellectual and spiritual one, which, to him, was the far greater infidelity. She had taken their sacred space and defiled it with another man's philosophy. What do you think? She finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Her gaze was pleading. He looked at the garish fin, a monument to shallowness. He looked at the vast, impersonal glass walls, designed for surface-level awe. He thought of the messages. Forget the soul. I'm trying to make you a star here. He saw with perfect, chilling clarity the choice she had made. And in that moment, he made his own. He would not fight her. He would not try to win her back. To do so would be to validate the contest, to imply that Rex's philosophy was even in the same league as theirs. He would let her have what she wanted. He would let her build her hollow thing, and he would create a world that would force her to see it for exactly what it was. He rose from his chair, walked over to her, and looked down at the iPad. He didn't look at her. It's very Pragmatic, he said, his voice quiet and steady. He chose the word with surgical precision. It was a word of business, of spreadsheets and bottom lines. It was a word they had never, in 14 years, associated with great art. Chloe flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. It wasn't the enthusiastic validation she craved, but it wasn't the argument she feared either. It was neutrality. It was worse. Liam looked up from the screen and finally met her eyes. His own were calm, placid, like the surface of a deep, cold lake. "I'm sure it will be successful." He turned and walked out of the studio, leaving her standing there in the glow of her compromised dream. The silence he left behind was total. Later that night, long after she had gone to bed, he returned to the room. He sat down, not in his armchair, but at his old, dusty writing desk. He opened his own laptop, the hinges creaking in protest. He stared at the blank document for a moment, the cursor blinking, blinking, blinking. The grief was a low hum beneath the floorboards. But above it, a plan was taking shape. The critic was coming back from the dead. The name came to him in the dead of night, dredged up from a half-forgotten university lecture on Roman history. Cincinnatus, the reluctant leader, the farmer called from his plow to save the city, who, upon victory, relinquished power and returned to his quiet life. The irony was bitter, but the fit was perfect. He, too, was being called from his quiet life of silent partnership. He wasn't saving a city, only an idea. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like a shard of ice in his heart, that there would be no triumphant return. For a week, Liam lived a life of quiet schism. By day, he was the ghost in his own house, moving through the rooms with a preternatural calm, his presence so muted that Chloe seemed to barely register it. He made coffee, tidied the kitchen, answered her distracted questions about his day with monosyllabic truths. He was a piece of the furniture, but by night, he was Cincinnatus. He would wait until the sound of Chloe's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep, then slip into the studio. The room had become a tomb, haunted by the ghost of their collaboration. He now sat at his desk, not hers, cloaked in the blue light of the monitor. He wrote with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the slow, philosophical excavation of his novel. This was a polemic, a manifesto. He surrounded himself with their books, Eliot, Frampton, the first edition of Kahn he'd just given Chloe, which she'd left on the living room coffee table, unread. He didn't open them. He didn't need to. He was channeling a decade of conversations, of late-night debates, of shared epiphanies. He was weaponizing their intimacy. The essay took shape, titled The Foundation of Things, a crisis of meaning in public spaces. He never mentioned the Westmeyer Museum. He didn't have to. He wrote about the silent contract between a building and its visitor. He decried the rise of architectural spectacle, coining the phrase hollow signifiers to describe buildings designed for viral fame rather than human experience. He wrote, with a passion that felt like mourning, about the integrity of materials, the narrative power of a well-considered floor plan, the moral weight of a threshold that prepares you for the art within. Every sentence was a tribute to Chloe's original design. Every paragraph was a quiet condemnation of the flashy thing she was now championing. He was ghostwriting the defense for the soul she had sold. One morning, as he was making coffee after a long night of writing, Chloe came into the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She was smiling, laughing in a way he hadn't heard in months, a bright, brittle sound. "No, Rex, that's brilliant," she said, pacing back and forth. "A brushed bronze finish? Yes, absolutely. It pops. It feels expensive." She saw Liam watching her and gave him a small, almost apologetic smile, as if he were a colleague. She was inconveniencing. "Okay, talk later." She hung up, her good mood palpable. Rex just had a breakthrough on the lobby fixtures. "It's going to look incredible." "Fixtures," Liam repeated, his voice flat. He handed her a mug of coffee. Their fingers brushed. He felt nothing. She, however, recoiled almost imperceptibly, a flicker of guilt in her eyes before it was buried again. "They matter," she said defensively. "The details matter." "Of course they do," he said, turning away. "You used to know which ones," he thought. That night, he finished the essay. He read it aloud to the empty studio, his voice low and steady. It was good. It was more than good. It was true. It was a eulogy and an indictment, and it was the most powerful thing he had ever written. He drafted an email to the editor of the Architectural Forum, a prestigious, slightly dusty online journal beloved by academics and purists, the kind of publication Rex Thorne wouldn't even know existed. To the editor, please find attached a submission for your consideration titled "The Foundation of Things." It is an essay concerning what I believe to be a growing crisis in contemporary design. Sincerely, Cincinnatus. He attached the file. His finger hovered over the send button. This was it, the first stone thrown, the first crack in the facade he intended to bring down. He wasn't attacking her, or Rex. He was building something next to them. A structure of ideas so clear, so resonant, that it would make their gaudy palace look like the temporary sham it was. He clicked the mouse. The email vanished into the ether. He felt no satisfaction, only a profound, hollow emptiness. He had taken the most beautiful thing in his life, their shared mind, and turned it into a tool. For 10 days, silence. Liam moved through his life, the waiting a low-grade hum beneath his skin. He started packing his books into boxes in his study, a quiet, methodical process. Chloe, consumed by the final push for the museum presentation, barely noticed. To her, it probably looked like a long overdue tidying up. Then, on a Tuesday morning, an email appeared in his inbox. The subject line was simple: "Your submission to the forum." "Dear Cincinnatus, thank you for your submission. I have been the editor of this journal for 20 years, and I can say without hesitation that your essay is one of the most vital, incisive, and desperately needed pieces of criticism I have read in the last decade. We are not only accepting it for publication, we would like to make it our lead featured article for this month. It goes live this Friday. Your voice is one that our world needs to hear. I hope we can expect more from you in the future. Regards, David Chen, editor, The Architectural Forum." Liam read the email 3 times. He closed his laptop and stared out the window of his study. The trap was now set. The ground had been prepared. He felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him. He wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. He was an architect, of a different sort, and he was about to see if his foundation would hold. It was Friday, the day of the presentation. The air in the sterile, open-plan office of Thorne Architecture was thick with the electric hum of forced confidence. People moved with sharp, purposeful strides, their voices clipped and efficient. It was the smell of performance, burnt coffee, expensive cologne, and the faint, ozonic scent of overworked servers. Chloe sat at her glass desk, scrolling through the finalized presentation one last time. Rex's design gleamed on her monitor, a symphony of slick renders and confident projections. It was impressive. It was a winner. She told herself this over and over, a mantra against the low, persistent thrum of anxiety in her veins. An email notification popped up in the corner of her screen. The sender was a name she hadn't seen in years. Professor Albright, her old mentor from graduate school. A fierce purist who had once told her she had the potential to build something that mattered. The subject line was simply, "Thought you should see this." Curious, she clicked the link. It took her to the homepage of the Architectural Forum. The site was stark, minimalist, black text on a white background. And there, at the top, was the featured article. "The Foundation of Things, A Crisis of Meaning in Public Spaces," by someone named Cincinnatus. She began to read. The first paragraph made her sit up straight. The author wrote about the grammar of space, a phrase Albright used to use, but one Liam had adopted and refined in their late-night talks. She read on, a strange feeling of vertigo sweeping over her. The writer spoke of hollow signifiers and the cheap thrill of the architectural spectacle. He lamented the loss of narrative integrity in public buildings. He talked about the soul of a structure. Her breath caught in her throat. It felt less like reading an essay and more like being eavesdropped on. Not on her conversations with Rex, but on the far more intimate ones she'd had with Liam over the last decade and a half. The words on the screen were Liam's words, his cadence, his arguments, his entire philosophy, distilled into a pure, devastatingly articulate form. It was the voice of her own conscience, the one she had been systematically silencing for months. Each sentence dismantled the justifications she had so carefully constructed. Each paragraph exposed the cheapness of the very principles her presentation was built on. She felt her face flush, a hot wave of shame and something else, a profound, aching regret. This was what she used to believe in. This was who she used to be. Ready to knock 'em dead, superstar? Chloe jumped, quickly minimizing the window as if it were contraband. Rex stood there, leaning against her desk, smelling of success and peppermint. He was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her first car, his smile a dazzling slash of white. Almost, she said, her voice unsteady. He noticed her expression. Hey, jitters? Don't. You're going to walk in there and own them. We're going to give them a building they can sell, a landmark. It's a lock. She hesitated, then made a decision. She had to know how he would react. She needed to see if he could engage with this, even for a moment. I was just reading something, she said, pulling the article back up on her screen. It's causing a bit of a stir online. A lot of academics are passing it around. Rex glanced at the title, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly at the edges. He scanned a few lines, his eyes moving quickly, dismissively. A little scoff escaped his lips. The moral weight of a threshold, he quoted, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. Christ, who has time for this crap? It's actually a very powerful argument, Chloe found herself saying, shocked at the defensive tone in her own voice. It's ivory tower nonsense, Chloe, he said, waving a hand as if to physically push the words away. It's written by some sad, failed academic who's bitter he never got to build anything. This is the real world. We don't build narratives. We build assets. This Cincinnatus clown talks about foundations. Our foundation is a 9-figure budget and a board that wants a return on their investment. That's it. End of story. He looked at her, and for the first time, the charisma seemed thin, like a cheap veneer. She saw a flash of deep, predatory insecurity in his eyes. He wasn't just dismissing the article. He was threatened by it. The writer makes some good points, though, she pushed, feeling a strange compulsion to defend the anonymous author, to defend Liam, about buildings needing to be more than just commodities. You're not getting cold feet on me, are you? Rex's voice lost its playful edge, replaced by a sharp, proprietary chill. After all the work we've put in, this is the kind of thinking that kept you stuck in mid-level hell for 10 years, Chloe. I'm the one who saw your killer instinct. Don't lose it now. He tapped the slick render of their glass and steel museum on her screen. This is power. That, he gestured contemptuously at the article, is a term paper. Now come on. Let's go make you famous. He turned and walked away towards the conference room, expecting her to follow. Chloe stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The crack had appeared. He hadn't just disagreed with the article. He had shown a fundamental contempt for the very ideals she once held sacred. He hadn't praised her mind. He'd praised her killer instinct. She looked back and forth between the two browser tabs. The soulless, spectacular building that promised success, and the quiet, powerful words that promised meaning. They were mutually exclusive. For the first time, she truly understood that a seed of sickening doubt, cold and hard, had been planted in the foundation of her new life, and she was due to present to the museum board in less than an hour. While Chloe and Rex walked into the lion's den, Liam was at home, hunting a lion of his own. He sat in the quiet of his study, the boxes of his packed-up books standing around him like silent sentinels. He knew the presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. He pictured the scene, the long mahogany table, the intimidatingly bland faces of the museum's board of trustees, the forced smiles. He pictured Chloe standing at the podium, Rex watching from the front row like a proud director. The image sent a pang of something sharp and cold through him, a feeling he refused to name. He pushed it down and focused on the task at hand. On his screen was a grainy photo of Alistair Finch. He was a man in his late 70s, with a wild mane of white hair, deep-set, critical eyes, and a mouth permanently set in a line of wry disapproval. Finch was the eminence grise of architectural criticism, a Pritzker juror whose praise was career-making and whose scorn was a public execution. He had written scathing, legendary takedowns of the exact kind of empty spectacle Rex Thorne championed. Finch was a purist, an ideologue, a man who believed buildings had souls. He was also, Liam knew, the most influential voice on the Westmeyer Selection Committee. He was the king on the chessboard. Liam had spent years reading Finch's work. He understood the man's intellectual vanities, his triggers, his profound disdain for the commercialization of his art form. Rex would see Finch as an obstacle to be managed or dazzled. Liam saw him as a potential ally who needed to be armed. He began to type, not to the forum's general inbox, but to a private university email address he'd found on an old syllabus. The message from Cincinnatus to Alistair Finch had to be perfect, a subtle blend of deference and intellectual kinship. The waiting room outside the Westmeyer boardroom was an exercise in hushed intimidation. The walls were a deep, wealthy gray, adorned with a single, massive, abstract painting that probably cost more than Liam's entire advance for his novel. The air was still and smelled of lemon polish and wool suits. Rex paced back and forth on the plush carpet, a panther radiating restless energy. He straightened his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. "Okay, remember," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "You hit them hard and fast. The renderings, the budget highlights, the social media engagement projections. Dazzle them with the numbers. When Finch asks his inevitable, crusty question about meaning, you pivot back to community impact. Frame it as a gift to the city." Chloe sat rigidly on a low leather sofa, the presentation remote, cold, and heavy in her hand. Rex's words, which once would have sounded like brilliant strategy, now sounded like a foreign language. Pivot, frame it, dazzle them. It was the vocabulary of a con man. The words of the Cincinnatus essay echoed in her mind. A building should not be a sales pitch. It should be a conversation. "Chloe? Are you listening to me?" Rex's voice was sharp. "Yes," she said, her own voice sounding distant. "Pivot to community impact." "Good! He'll try to trip you up. He's a dinosaur. Just smile, call it a fascinating question, and steer the conversation back to our turf. He can't fight us on the numbers." She looked at Rex, at his handsome, anxious face, and a thought surfaced, unwelcome and undeniable. He's afraid of him. Rex's entire strategy was built on avoiding the very questions Alistair Finch was famous for asking. His philosophy had no defense against a simple, honest why. A severe-looking woman opened the boardroom door. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Vance, the committee is ready for you." Rex's face instantly transformed, the anxiety vanishing beneath a mask of unassailable confidence. He shot Chloe a brilliant smile and a quick, conspiratorial wink, as if they were partners in the perfect crime. As Chloe stood up, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from her body, she realized that perhaps they were. Liam read the email draft one last time. Dear Mr. Finch, I am writing to you under a pseudonym for reasons that are professional rather than evasive. I am the author of the essay, The Foundation of Things, which was featured in the forum this morning. I am not writing to solicit praise, but rather on the assumption that you and I might be two of the last people who still believe in the principles outlined within it. I was told that you once defined integrity as a structure that is honest about the load it carries. It is a definition I have carried with me for years. I simply hope the essay might find its way to one of the few readers who could truly understand its foundation. Sincerely, Cincinnatus. It was perfect. It was flattering without being sycophantic. It invoked Finch's own words, creating an immediate sense of shared belief. It positioned them as fellow soldiers in a lonely war. It was an invitation. He attached the link to the article. He pictured Alistair Finch, perhaps sitting in his own study, scrolling through the morning's news. Liam hit send. The email was gone. The second shot was fired, aimed at the heart of the enemy's command. He leaned back in his chair, the study oppressively quiet around him. There was nothing more he could do. He had placed his faith in the power of a single, well-reasoned idea to change the world, or at least a small, significant corner of it. He closed his eyes and saw the beautiful, defiant curve Chloe had drawn on vellum what felt like a lifetime ago. A line of charcoal against the void. The first presentation was not a success. It was not a failure, either. It was something far worse. It was dismissed. They walked out of the boardroom into the hushed corridor, the heavy door clicking shut behind them, sealing in the polite, non-committal smiles of the board. Rex's own smile was a rigid, brittle thing. He had been blindsided. Alistair Finch, who normally sat through presentations with an air of bored out of his mind superiority, had been armed. He hadn't attacked their design. He had simply asked one quiet question after Chloe's final, slick rendering faded from the screen. Ms. Vance, Finch had said, his ancient eyes pinning her from across the mahogany expanse. Your building is certainly arresting, but what is it trying to say? The simple question had hung in the air, a wrecking ball aimed at the heart of their pitch. Chloe had pivoted, just as Rex had coached. She talked about community, about iconic status, about public engagement. Finch had listened patiently, then given a single, almost imperceptible nod, and said nothing more for the rest of the meeting. His silence was more damning than any tirade. Back in the sterile sanctuary of Rex's corner office, the mask of confidence finally shattered. He ripped off his tie and threw it onto his black leather sofa. What is it trying to say? He spat, mimicking Finch's reedy voice. The old bastard. He's been reading that goddamn article. What article? Chloe asked, though she knew the answer. A cold dread was creeping up her spine. The Foundation. Garbage. It's all over the blogs this afternoon, Rex snapped, jabbing at his monitor. He spun it to face her. It was a post from a highly respected industry blog, Nodes and Voids. The headline read, Alistair Finch on Cincinnatus. A desperately needed voice in a wilderness of hollow signifiers. The post detailed how Finch, in an email exchange, had praised the anonymous essay and stated that he was now looking for a Westmeyer proposal that demonstrated unimpeachable foundational integrity. Liam's words. Finch was quoting Liam's words. Chloe felt a wave of dizziness. The essay wasn't just a stone thrown into a pond. It was a targeted torpedo, and it had just hit them broadside. Liam had orchestrated this. The realization was so absurd, so outlandish, that she almost dismissed it. Quiet, passive Liam. But the precision of it, the chillingly perfect timing, it was undeniable. He hadn't been grieving. He'd been plotting. He's trying to poison the well, Rex was ranting, pacing behind his enormous desk. These pretentious academics, they can't build anything, so they just try to tear down the people who can. They want to talk about meaning? I'll give them meaning. He grabbed a stylus and pulled up their design on a massive tablet. With a few angry, slashing strokes, he erased the clean roofline. We need more wow. We need something so spectacular it makes Finch's philosophy look irrelevant. A statement he began to sketch, his movements frantic and ugly. A huge, crystalline bubble began to grow out of the museum's roof, a glass atrium that was completely alien to the building's existing geometry. It was structurally dubious and thematically incoherent. It was a panic attack rendered in pixels. "What is that?" Chloe asked, her voice quiet. "It's the new centerpiece," Rex declared, a wild, feverish look in his eyes. "A suspended glass conservatory. A garden in the sky. We'll fill it with exotic trees. It's got spectacle. It's got a green angle. It's unassailable." Chloe stared at the monstrous addition. It was a tumor, a gaudy, desperate lie appended to an already compromised design. And something in her finally snapped. "No," she said. Rex stopped sketching. "No? What do you mean, no?" "It's thematically absurd, Rex," she said, the words coming to her unbidden, dredged up from a deeper place. "It has no relationship to the rest of the structure. It's just stuck on top. It's a feature. It's the wow factor we need." "A building can't just be a collection of features," she argued, standing up. She heard her voice rising, filled with a conviction she hadn't felt in months. "It needs a unifying idea, a narrative." "What is the narrative here? That if you can't achieve genuine awe, you can just buy it and bolt it on?" Rex stared at her, dumbfounded. "Where is this coming from? This is the kind of talk that gets us laughed out of the room." "It's the only talk that matters," she countered. "A structure has to be honest about the load it carries. That thing," she pointed at the monstrous bubble on the screen, "is a lie. It's pretending to be part of a whole, but it's a parasite." She stopped, her own words echoing in the silent minimalist office. Honest about the load it carries. Liam's favorite phrase, from his favorite dead architect. A parasite. The word she had used in her own mind to describe Rex's influence. She was standing in her lover's office, looking at his face, contorted with rage and confusion, and she was channeling her husband. She was defending Liam's entire worldview against the man for whom she had sacrificed it. The conflict wasn't in the boardroom anymore. It wasn't on the blog post, or even in the essay. It was right here, in this room, inside her. The realization was a physical blow. The affair, the ambition, the hunger for validation, it had all led her to this single, excruciating moment of clarity. She was defending the foundation of her life from the man she was letting demolish it. She looked at Rex, at his slick, expensive rage, and for the first time, she didn't see a powerful, charismatic mentor. She saw a man who built things that could not stand. The week leading up to the final presentation was a quiet, waking nightmare. Chloe moved through her life like a phantom. The argument with Rex had ended not with a resolution, but with a cold, terrifying impasse. He believed her silence was acquiescence, a woman's pout that would pass. He forged ahead with the new renderings, the absurd glass bubble now rendered in photorealistic detail, gleaming like a jewel on a diseased appendage. He saw it as a masterpiece of reactive genius. Chloe saw it as a confession of profound bankruptcy. She barely slept. Every night, she found herself drawn back to the studio. The room felt different now, imbued with a ghostly presence she could no longer ignore. It was Liam's room as much as it was hers. His armchair, his books, his ideas, they were all here. The air was thick with his absence. One night, unable to bear the hum of the workstation displaying Rex's latest atrocity, she went to the old flat files in the corner. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out a wide, shallow drawer. There they were, the original vellum sketches for the Westmeyer. She unrolled them carefully on the drafting table. There it was, the single, defiant curve, the spine, The honest, intelligent, beautiful thing she had created with him. It was a design that didn't shout. It spoke. It had integrity. It had a soul. Looking at it felt like looking at a photograph of her own face before a long, disfiguring illness. A decision formed, not as a conscious thought, but as a deep, instinctual need. It was an act of penance. For the next 3 nights, after Rex would text a smarmy, "Good night, superstar," and before the sun would rise on another day of her hollowed-out life, she worked. Fueled by stale coffee and a burning, clarifying regret, she built a second presentation. She used her old templates, her old fonts. She wrote her own notes, using her own words. The words of Cincinnatus, the words of Liam. She worked until her eyes burned, until the original design lived again. A fully formed vision on a single, unmarked flash drive. The morning of the final presentation arrived with a cold, gray finality. Chloe stood before her closet, her hand hovering between the sharply tailored, aggressive power suit Rex had insisted she buy and a simpler, softer gray dress she'd owned for years. She chose the dress. When she came into the kitchen, Rex was already there, brimming with predatory energy. He was holding 2 flash drives. "Got 'em," he said, shaking the identical silver sticks. "Ours and the backup. Ready to close the deal?" He didn't seem to notice her dress, or the dark circles under her eyes, or the fact that she looked like a woman walking to her own execution. Her phone vibrated on the granite countertop. She picked it up. A text from an unsaved number, but she knew it was him. Her heart seized. It was the first time he had initiated contact in weeks. The message was 6 words long. "Whatever you build, make sure it has a strong foundation." She stared at the screen, the black letters stark against the white background. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a release. It was the core principle of his life, of their life together, offered up not as a weapon, but as a compass. It was the purest, most devastating expression of his love she could imagine. A love for the person he still believed she was, underneath all the rubble. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away before Rex could see. "Hey," he said, his voice softening with synthetic concern. "Nervous? Don't be. I'll be right there with you." He slid an arm around her, pulling her into his side. His touch felt alien. "Just stick to the script. We've got this." She slipped her phone into her pocket and took a deep, shuddering breath. In the car, Rex chattered endlessly. A last-minute coaching session filled with his usual buzzwords. Disruptive. Game-changing. Legacy. The words washed over her. Meaningless noise. She said nothing, her hand clenching in her pocket around the cool, smooth metal of her own flash drive. The one Rex didn't know about. On it were 2 folders side by side. One labeled RT Final. The other labeled simply CV Original. They pulled up to the museum. The grand stone entrance loomed before them. Rex killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. He turned to her, his face alight with ambition. "This is it, Chloe? The day you become a legend." She looked from his eager face to the imposing building, and then down at her own hands, resting in her lap. She thought of Liam's text. She thought of the beautiful, defiant curve on the vellum. She thought of the person she had been and the person she was about to become. The choice was hers. The foundation, for better or worse, was hers to build. She opened the car door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The boardroom was just as she remembered it. Only today it felt smaller, the air sucked out of it by the combined weight of expectation and deceit. Rex took his seat in the front row, directly in her line of sight, and gave her a sharp, encouraging nod. He looked like a proud owner, watching his prize horse at the starting gate. Across the table, Alistair Finch watched her with those impassive, ancient eyes, his expression unreadable. He looked tired. He looked disappointed. Chloe walked to the podium on unsteady legs. She plugged in her flash drive, The one from Rex's hand, the one he thought was the only copy. Her own was still in her pocket, a secret, heavy promise. With a click, the presentation came to life on the massive screen behind her. The first slide was the money shot, the soulless glass box crowned with Rex's hideous, desperate atrium. The garden in the sky gleamed under a digitally rendered sun, a monument to everything she had come to despise. From the front row, Rex's smile widened. He gave her a subtle thumbs up. She opened her mouth to speak the scripted words, the slick, persuasive lies they had rehearsed. "Good morning," she began, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "What you see behind me is more than a building. It is a statement, a landmark for the future." Her eyes drifted from the screen to the faces of the board. They were impassive, listening. Then she looked at Finch. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his expression, a profound, weary sadness. It was the look of a man who had hoped for better and had been let down once again. Then she looked at Rex. He wasn't looking at her with support. He was looking at her with the predatory focus of a gambler watching his final bet. He gave another tiny, commanding nod, urging her on. Sell it. In that instant, the entire fragile architecture of her life collapsed. The affair, the lies, the ambition, it was all a shoddy structure built on a corrupt foundation. And she heard Liam's voice, not from his text, but from the sanctuary of their shared past. Whatever you build, make sure it has a strong foundation. She faltered. The next word of her script died in her throat. The silence stretched. Rex's smile froze, a flicker of panic in his eyes. She started again, then stopped. She took a deep breath, and with a decisive click of the mouse, she closed the presentation. The screen went black. A collective gasp went through the room. Rex shot halfway out of his seat. "What I've just shown you," Chloe said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, ringing with a terrifying, liberating honesty, "is a failure. It is a building with no integrity. It is a structure with no soul. And I cannot, in good conscience, ask you to build it." Rex's face was a mask of pure, white-hot fury. Before he could object, Chloe ejected his flash drive, reached into her pocket, and inserted her own. A new file structure appeared on the screen. She clicked the folder labeled CV Original. The image that filled the screen was not a slick render. It was her charcoal sketch. The single, defiant curve, the spine. "A museum shouldn't be a spectacle," she said, speaking from a place of resurrected conviction, the words pouring out of her. "It shouldn't be a commodity. It should be a conversation. It must have a foundational idea, a narrative that guides the visitor from the moment they cross the threshold." For 20 minutes, she spoke without notes, her voice filled with a passion none of them had ever heard from her. She walked them through her original design, explaining not just the structure, but the philosophy. She used her words, Liam's words, the words of Cincinnatus. She spoke of the grammar of space, of the moral weight of materials, of a building that respected the art within and the visitor without. She didn't sell it. She explained it. She defended it. She reclaimed it. When she finished, there was a stunned silence. She looked at Rex. He was ashen, staring at her with a look of utter betrayal and humiliation. He was erased. Then she looked at Alistair Finch. The weariness was gone from his eyes. He was leaning forward, and for the first time, he was smiling. She didn't win the competition. As Finch explained to her later, after he'd sought her out in the corridor, the board was too timid, too seduced by the flashy mediocrity of the runner-up. "But you," he said, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes alight with respect. "What you did in there today was an act of profound integrity. That is rarer than a winning commission, Ms. Vance. I'm opening a new wing of my firm. I want people who build with conviction. I want you to run it." It was the validation she had craved for years, earned not by compromise, but by its rejection. She had won back her professional soul. She drove home in a daze, the prestigious job offer a distant, hollow echo. As she turned onto her street, she knew the house looked different, quieter. A space had been emptied. Liam's car was gone. She walked through the unlocked front door into a house that was no longer a home. It was clean, tidy, and utterly devoid of his presence. His books were gone from the shelves, his coat gone from the hook. He had packed up his life and excised himself from hers with the same quiet, methodical precision he had used to write his essay. He hadn't left a note. He didn't need to. His final text message had been his goodbye. She walked to the studio, the heart of their world. It was sterile. Her drafting table was clear, wiped clean, a blank slate. He had left her the room, the tools of her trade. But in the very center of the vast, empty surface lay a single object. A small, square, crumpled cocktail napkin. Her breath hitched. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she smoothed it out. On it, in faded blue ink, were the first frantic sketches she and Liam had ever made for a home of their own, drawn on the night he'd proposed, 14 years ago. A small house with a massive library and a shared studio. A home with a strong foundation. The silence of the room was absolute, deafening. She had it all now. The respect of her peers, a career-defining job, her integrity. But the only person in the world who had ever truly seen her, who had loved her mind and protected her soul, was gone. Her profound, gut-wrenching regret was not just for the affair, but for her own tragic blindness. She had searched the entire world for validation when it had been waiting for her at home all along, in a quiet armchair, in a shared glance, in the silent, unwavering support of a love she had mistaken for a piece of furniture. She collapsed into her chair, the crumpled napkin clutched in her hand, and her tears finally came, falling onto the faded ink, blurring the lines of the home they would never build.